What do you think cuts deeper? Losing the home you built brick by brick, or watching the very son you gave birth to order its destruction? Travis believed that leveling his mother's dilapidated house was the quickest path to a new life. But he was making the biggest mistake of his existence, because right beneath that rubble, he dismissed as trash, lay not only a literal gold mine, but also a love secret, stolen 50 years ago, a secret with the power to rewrite everyone's destiny. Before we begin, I'm so curious to know, where in the world are you listening from? Please leave a comment down below. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and get your tissues ready, because this story of betrayal, redemption, and miraculous rebirth is guaranteed to bring you to tears. Let's get started. Year 2001, when the calendar marked a new century, but the paved streets of Missouri still smelled of damp earth, freshly baked apple pie, and old memories. Miss Dorothy woke up every morning in the house she had built with her own hands, rising with a gentle but accustomed effort from the firm mattress of her bed, feeling her knees protest a little, but her will remain the same as when she was a young schoolteacher hauling bricks after leaving the schoolhouse. That house, made of red brick, with a shingle roof and a small row of flower pots on the porch, was not simply a place to store furniture and sleep, but a piece of her soul solidified in walls and foundations, a shelter she had raised alone, without a husband, while raising her son, Travis. And every corner of that home held the echo of her hurried steps on the way to school, the smell of the stew simmering on the stove, the quiet sighs she let out when she counted the dollars at the end of the month to see if there was enough for the cement, for the bricks, for the next improvement she dreamed of making. At 72 years old, she moved through the kitchen like someone traversing a known map, affectionately touching the wooden table marked by the years, smoothing with the palm of her hand the floral tablecloth that was already somewhat faded, looking out the window at the small garden where hydrangeas, marigolds, and a sagebush grew, which she said protected the house from bad energy. And while she put the water on to boil for her morning coffee, she thought that God had been tough, yes, but also just, because he had given her the strength to work all her life. He had allowed her to teach generations of students in those classrooms with pale walls and green chalkboards, and above all, he had given her the opportunity to build that roof under which she had seen her son take his first steps as a man. Even if that son was now a stranger who seemed ashamed of the roots of brick and earth that she loved so much. The house breathed with her because the walls showed the hands that raised them, small and bony hands, but stubborn, that in the 60 seconds and 70 seconds, after school hours, took off their comfortable teacher's shoes and put on some old sneakers to help the contractors, mixing sand and cement with a shovel almost as big as she was, watching that the water didn't overflow, counting one by one the bricks she paid for with her salary, while she thought about Travis's future and the silent promise she had made to herself that this boy would grow up with something she never had, a home of his own, solid, where the rain didn't leak through the cracks in the roof, nor the freezing wind enter like a knife into the bones. That's why, every time a neighbor leaned over to tell her she was too old to be carrying such heavy things, Dorothy responded that the bricks didn't weigh her down. What weighed her down was the idea of leaving her son a world without roots, and that she preferred to get tired now than to see how he, as an adult, would be ashamed to say he had grown up in a borrowed house. And so, with that mixture of pride and stubbornness, she went on raising that modest one-story construction with a small backyard at the end, a concrete wash basin next to the oak tree, and a living room where, instead of luxuries, there were framed photographs of generations of students and a couple of religious pictures placed with devotion. When she finally retired, after decades in front of the chalkboard, she didn't dream of traveling or sitting down to do nothing, but of getting up every day to sweep her porch, water the plants, prepare her own coffee, and listen to the loving silence of that house that had seen so much. And every morning, when she opened the front door and the sun slipped in diagonally over the polished concrete floor, she felt that the whole world fit into that rectangle of light that formed in the living room, because there, within humble walls, were her memories, her work, her sacrifices, the nights she graded notebooks until dawn while Travis slept in an iron bed a few feet away, the times she saved to buy a handful of shingles more, the moment she could finally put in a new window with a metal frame and clear glass. And that's why, when someone told her that her house was very simple, She responded with a slight smile that, yes, maybe it was simple. But inside, it fit a whole life. Travis, the son for whom she had stayed up late so many times, saw none of that when he arrived. Every now and then, with a hurried step and the sound of car keys jingling in his hand, moving through the living room as if it didn't belong to him, looking up and down at the whitewashed walls, the concrete floor, the wooden table, the worn but clean armchair, and in his gaze, you could guess a contempt he didn't try to hide. At 45 years old, and with an oversized idea of himself, Travis presented himself as a businessman. He spoke with bombastic words of investments, opportunities, contacts, and yet he hadn't been able to sustain a stable business because the same ambition that pushed him to try new things also made him neglect what he had in his hands, always looking for the stroke of luck, the miraculous project that would take him out of the heap and put him above those he considered mediocre. And in that group, without saying it explicitly, he placed his own mother, that retired teacher who was content with a modest pension and a humble house. Jessica, his wife, reinforced that feeling every time she set foot on the small porch adorned with flower pots and looked around with the eyes of someone entering a place not up to her status, delicately placing her expensive purse on a chair and crossing her legs elegantly, avoiding letting her fine fabric skirt graze the floor too much. And when Dorothy turned toward the kitchen to pour them coffee, she took the opportunity to whisper to Travis that it was time to leave that neighborhood behind, that a man like him deserved another kind of environment, that how was he going to receive his partners in a house with cracked walls and without central air conditioning? And those words, loaded with a mixture of poison and apparent concern, stuck into Travis's sensitive pride like invisible needles. One evening, the tension solidified into a cruel ultimatum. Jessica had organized a dinner at Dorothy's house, not to celebrate family, but to showcase her disdain. She wrinkled her nose at the aroma of Dorothy's signature beef stew, a recipe that had warmed Travis for 40 years. "It smells like stagnation in here," Jessica remarked, pushing her plate away untouched. She pulled out a glossy brochure from her bag and slid it across the table toward Dorothy. It was a pamphlet for Sunset Meadows, a nursing home on the outskirts of the city, a sterile, cold place known more for its low cost than its care. "Travis and I think you'd be happier here, Dorothy," Jessica said with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this crumbling heap, and we could finally put the land to good use." Dorothy looked at her son, waiting for him to defend her, to say that his mother was not a burden to be discarded. But Travis just stared at his water glass, mumbling, "It's got great facilities, Mom. You're getting too old for this." That silence broke Dorothy's heart more than any shout could. She realized then that she wasn't just losing her son to ambition. She was losing him to a woman who saw people as disposable assets. Dorothy, who was neither stupid nor blind, noticed her daughter-in-law's fleeting glances, that gesture with which she smelled the air, as if she wanted to know how long she would endure being there. And although she said nothing, her hands tightened a little more on the edge of the table when she set down the cups, because she felt that they not only despised her house, but everything that house represented, decades of sacrifice and renunciations, the afternoons when her son came home from school, not knowing that she had accepted giving extra classes to the neighborhood children to gather a little more money to buy a few more cinder blocks. Travis, obliged by custom and perhaps by a remnant of affection he didn't know how to show, sat at the table and spoke to his mother curtly, telling her about his businesses and failures, with a tone that mixed complaints and justifications, saying that the market was tough, that people didn't know how to recognize opportunities, that in this country it was impossible to progress if one didn't take risks. And Jessica nodded, adding that times had changed, that it was no longer enough to have a little house and a steady job, that now everything was image, and that if they wanted to climb, they needed a place that reflected success, not that vestige of poorly paid effort that was, in both of their eyes, Miss Dorothy's home. She, however, listened to them without losing her calm, with that serenity that years give and the certainty of having done what was right. And when Travis complained about what he didn't have, she responded softly that there were many ways to be rich, that some only looked at money, but that there were other treasures that weren't counted in dollar bills. And that kind of response made her son roll his eyes with impatience, as if he were hearing an old fairy tale, that no longer served the modern world. One day, the weight of the debts Travis had been dragging for some time fell upon Dorothy's house like a shadow spreading across the walls. The creditors were no longer content with promises. The partners had stopped answering calls, and the numbers in his bank accounts were like a black hole swallowing any attempt at calm. So, desperate, he arrived at his mother's house with a tense face, furrowed brows, and trembling hands, not so much from fear, but from the rage of feeling cornered, and planted himself in the middle of the living room, in front of her, who was folding some tablecloths on the table, to blurt out, with a voice loaded with contained fury, that this house is worth nothing, Mother, and that he was going to demolish it to build something worthy of his last name. He didn't say it as a suggestion or a request. He spat it out like a sentence, convinced he was taking the logical step, the only one that made sense in his agitatedly practical mind, where everything could be transformed into capital if used cunningly. And while his words fell in the air like stones, Dorothy looked at him with a mixture of surprise and sadness, setting aside the tablecloth she held in her hands, breathing deeply before responding, because she knew an impulsive reaction would only add fuel to the fire. Then, with that quiet firmness that had sustained her in front of generations of restless students, she said that this house is worth everything, son, because it was made with love, not pride. And it's not just about bricks, but about the history those bricks hold, of the sleepless nights, the sweat that dried on those walls, of your laughter when you were a boy running in the yard, even the tears I shed when I was widowed and still decided not to sell the land your late father had barely started paying for before dying. Travis, instead of being moved, got more irritated hearing those words, interpreting them as a sentimental obstacle in the middle of his desperate need for money, and replied, raising his tone, that she lived in the past, that her love and pride didn't pay debts or interest, that one had to be practical, that with that land he could build modern apartments or sell it at a good price to liquidate everything, and that if she really loved him, she should help him now instead of clinging to a pile of old bricks. The echo of his voice mixed with the distant hum of the town, and for a moment the small dining room seemed too small to contain so much tension. But Dorothy, without moving from her chair, repeated calmly that she would not hand over the house, that she preferred to die right there than to see it torn down on the whim of someone who confused dignity with appearance, that she understood her son was in trouble, but that this was not the solution. And she added, with a glint of pain in her eyes, that the way he spoke of his home hurt her more than any debt he might have. That answer, instead of opening the door to dialogue, became a wall, because Travis, incapable of accepting a no, felt his mother was betraying him, siding with an old construction instead of him. And when he left that afternoon slamming the door, the whole house vibrated as if the walls shared the blow Dorothy's heart had just received. It was in the following days, when the loneliness in the house became denser and the silence filled with unanswered questions, that Jessica took advantage of every conversation with Travis to stoke the fire of his resentment. It is terrifying to watch how easily a toxic influence can twist a son's heart against the woman who gave him life. Travis is letting his pride blind him, and unfortunately, he is about to cross a line that can never be uncrossed. Brace yourselves, because the decision he makes next is going to leave the whole neighborhood in shock. They sat in the living room of the apartment where they lived, surrounded by furniture bought on credit, and she told him she didn't understand how his mother could be so selfish, that after everything he had tried to do, after so many sacrifices, the minimum was that she let him take advantage of that land, that perhaps age had made her stubborn, that maybe she wasn't even aware of the property's real value, and that if he didn't take a drastic decision, everything would come crashing down, because the creditors weren't going to wait for a 70-something-year-old lady to change her mind. Travis, with his head in his hands, listened to those words like someone receiving confirmation of what he already thought deep down. And every time Jessica mentioned the word worthy, associating it with a modern building and not the brick and flower house of his childhood, his pride inflamed, remembering the comments of friends or partners who had once mocked when they knew where he came from, what neighborhood, what kind of house. And in his mind, the idea began to form that his mother was not only an economic obstacle, but also the representation of a past he wanted to leave behind. It was then that, blinded by greed, frustration, and the poison of others' words, he made a dark decision. He wouldn't wait for her to authorize anything. He wouldn't keep begging. He would act on his own, In a gray office downtown, he met with an acquaintance who owed him favors and had contacts at City Hall, and with a low voice but hard determination, explained that he needed quick permits to demolish an old house in a working-class neighborhood. He assured him he was the legitimate owner, that his mother was very old and had authorized it verbally, and the acquaintance, seeing an opportunity to gain something in return, pulled strings, got papers, stamps, and signatures that wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny but were enough to fool the majority, and he handed them over in a manila envelope that felt as heavy as a sentence when Travis held it in his hands. He left that meeting with a racing heart, aware that he was crossing a line with no return, but trying to calm his conscience, telling himself that he was doing it all for the good of everyone, that in the end his mother would understand, that maybe at first she would be upset, but when she saw the new building or when she felt the peace of knowing the debts were paid, she would forgive him. Travis didn't wait for her to leave town. His ambition had turned into a monster that demanded to be fed immediately. Early that morning, the roar of heavy machinery shook the flower pots on Dorothy's porch. She rushed out, her heart pounding, only to see a yellow bulldozer positioning its blade against her garden wall. And there, directing the chaos, was Travis's stop. "What are you doing?" Dorothy screamed, running toward the machine, her frail body forming a human shield between the steel beast and her home. Travis marched over, his face twisted not with shame, but with annoyance. He didn't hug her. He didn't explain. He grabbed her arm with a grip so tight it would leave bruises. "Get out of the way, Mother! You're making a scene," he hissed, his voice cold enough to freeze the morning air. "This is my life, Travis." "You can't," she cried, clutching his lapel. In a moment that silenced the gathered neighbors, Travis shoved her, his own mother, stumbling her backward onto the sidewalk. "It's a pile of junk, just like your stubbornness," he shouted for everyone to hear, stripping her of her dignity and public security. "Take this senile woman away so we can work." Two indifferent workers held Miss Dorothy back by her arms as if she were a criminal, forcing her to watch. She wasn't just losing a house. She was being treated like a stray animal by the boy she had once rocked to sleep. The first crunch of wood wasn't just a sound. It was the noise of a mother's heart shattering into dust. It's hard to imagine a pain sharper than watching your life's work destroyed by the person you built it for. Yet, in this darkest moment, the rubble is actually hiding a secret that will turn Dorothy's tragedy into a miracle. Keep listening, because what she finds changes everything. Hours later, when the noise finally ceased and the dust began to settle, what remained in the place where the brick and flower house once stood was a pile of piled rubble, wall fragments, pieces of twisted metal sheeting, chunks of wood, shattered glass, a shapeless mountain occupying the space of the old home like an open grave. And over that desolate landscape still floated a fine gray dust that stuck to the skin and got into the throat of anyone breathing nearby, forcing them to cough. The yard no longer existed as such. The wash basin was buried. The oak tree, broken, lay with its branches extended like defeated arms. The workers gathered their things, commenting among themselves that it was always a bit of a pity to demolish old houses, but that was the job. But not everyone watched in silence. Mr. Henderson, a retired lawyer who lived across the street, had witnessed the entire spectacle from his porch. He was a man of few words but iron principles, and he had known Dorothy since Travis was in diapers. While the dust was still settling, he didn't approach Dorothy immediately. Instead, he quietly took out his phone and took photos of the demolition crew, the license plates of the trucks, and most importantly, the lack of proper safety barriers. He walked over to the fence line, picked up a discarded permit sheet that had blown onto the sidewalk, and adjusted his glasses. He recognized the forged signature stamp instantly. It belonged to a city clerk who had been fired 2 years ago. "You made a mistake, son," Henderson whispered to the retreating silhouette of Travis's car. "You forgot that in this neighborhood, we look out for our own." He folded the paper into his pocket, the first stone in the avalanche that would soon bury Travis. And the foreman informed Travis that everything was ready, that all that remained was to remove some debris and level the land when he indicated. He nodded with a tense face, feeling the smell of dust sticking inside him. And then he left, leaving everything like that, waiting for a future project he still didn't know exactly what it would be, but which in his mind already justified what had just happened. Meanwhile, on the bus bringing her back, Miss Dorothy looked out the window at the passing landscape hills, houses, power lines, and thought of her sick friend, remembering how she had found her thinner, but with a grateful smile upon seeing her arrive. And she felt that although life brought pain, it also took care to put small consolations on the path, like reuniting with someone she once taught to read and who now, despite the illness, kept holding on to hope. She was in no hurry to get home, but she did have the peaceful desire to see her porch again, to put on more comfortable clothes, to heat up a little soup, and perhaps call a neighbor to tell her how it went, because at that age, shared stories are a way of extending life. When the bus entered the neighborhood and she got off, the air seemed a little heavier than usual, perhaps because of the dust in the atmosphere she saw floating in the afternoon sun rays. But she didn't suspect that dust came from her own roof, from her own walls. She walked with slow but sure steps down the street, greeting a neighbor who looked at her with a mixture of surprise and nervousness, responding to her greeting with a forced smile. And when she turned the corner that led directly to her house, the world as she knew it broke into 1,000 pieces. Where the humble brick facade with its wooden door, the window with the white-painted iron grate, and the flower pots at the entrance once stood, there was only an open hole full of debris, a wounded plot covered in stones, pieces of wall, and materials. For a second her mind refused to comprehend what her eyes were seeing, and she stood still, as if an invisible force had nailed her to the ground, feeling her heart skip a beat so huge she feared it wouldn't finish beating correctly. Then, as if someone had removed a veil, the noise of the world returned, the murmur of cars, distant voices, and she advanced a few steps, stumbling until she was in front of the mountain of rubble, trying to find among all that some recognizable fragment of her house, and not seeing it, a wave of pain pierced her from head to toe. Her knees gave way, and she let herself fall to the ground like a collapsed prayer, lifting in her trembling hands a broken brick that had landed within her reach, looking at it like someone contemplating a wounded body, and with a voice broken by a cry that hadn't yet fully come out, she said, "Good Lord, if the sun had destroyed the roof that gave him shelter, then where did a mother's soul sleep?" And that question, thrown into the air with a shattered heart, remained floating over the ruins like an ancient lament, like an open wound no one knew how to close. The neighbors who had peeked out to see her arrive looked at her with pity, some with guilt, knowing they had kept quiet because they didn't know how to warn her in time. Others murmured that it was a tragedy, asking how it was possible. What kind of son does that? But no one dared to approach immediately, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear of seeing so much pain condensed in a single person up close. After a few minutes that felt eternal, Dorothy stopped crying noisily, although the tears kept rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. And she began, almost without realizing it, to move her hands over the rubble, moving pieces of cement, chunks of wood, and bricks with a decided slowness, as if she were digging in search of something she didn't yet know what it was. A neighbor approached and told her she better stop, that she could hurt herself, that it was dangerous. But she responded that she wasn't looking to save furniture or things, that she just wanted to find a piece of her life that wasn't broken, something to tell her that not everything was lost, and she kept lifting with effort what she could, feeling the dirt and dust getting under her nails, her arms aching, but without stopping, because the inertia of pain sometimes transforms into movement when staying still hurts more. Her breathing was agitated, sweat mixed with the dust on her forehead, and her reddened eyes scanned every corner of that mountain of remains, looking perhaps for a photograph, a crucifix, a piece of the table where she had graded exams, something to remind her that not everything had been razed by her own son's greed. The afternoon advanced, and the shadows of the neighboring houses lengthened over the demolished lot. But she was still there, bending down, getting up, stumbling sometimes, refusing to accept that the only thing she could do was cry. At some point, a braver or closer neighbor decided to intervene in another way and offered her a bottle of water, telling her to sit for a moment, to calm down, that they would see how something could be fixed. But Dorothy, taking barely a sip, told him she needed to keep looking, that she felt that beneath so much rubble there was something that shouldn't remain buried forever, that something was calling her from down there. And the man, without fully understanding but moved by her determination, also started moving stones by her side. And soon another neighbor joined, and then another, until there were several hands helping to open paths in that mountain of ruins. However, she was the only one who knew exactly what she was looking for, although she couldn't name it yet, because what guided her wasn't a concrete idea, but that deep intuition that people who have suffered a lot sometimes have. Having learned to recognize when destiny is about to reveal something it had kept silent for years. It was in one of those movements, near the spot where the great oak tree had been ripped from the earth, that her fingers grazed something hard and cold. It didn't have the rough texture of brick, nor the roughness of cement. She stopped abruptly. She carefully brushed away the soil and small roots covering the object and saw, entangled in the broken roots of the fallen tree, a corner of rusted metal. Her hands, bleeding slightly from moving the rough stones, trembled violently. It was as if the house, in its final moment of death, had decided to surrender the secret it had guarded for 50 years. Travis had destroyed the walls to find money, but the earth was offering Dorothy the truth. Sometimes, the universe has a strange way of balancing the scales. While Travis sought profit, Dorothy found a truth buried for 50 years. This discovery is about to reignite a love story that everyone thought was dead. Let's see where this old key leads her. Her heart gave a strange leap. She realized that this wasn't part of the house's structure, but something that had been buried deep beneath the ancient tree long before she ever laid the first brick of her home. She called the attention of the neighbors helping her and told them she thought she had found something, to please help her clear that spot without smashing it to pieces. And between two men, they delicately lifted the chunks of rubble remaining on top of the metallic structure until they managed to bring to the surface a heavy rectangular metal box covered in rust with an old padlock that had long ago ceased to function. When she had it in her hands, Dorothy felt the weight wasn't just physical, but also symbolic, as if she were touching a piece of the past she hadn't been told about. And she sat on a large stone, holding the box on her knees, breathing deeply before deciding what to do. The neighbors looked at her with curiosity, wondering what could be inside, if it would be papers, money, photos, but no one dared to pressure her because the moment had been tinged with unexpected solemnity. She, with hands still trembling from effort and emotion, ran her fingers over the rough surface, noting every rust stain, every dent, as if they were wrinkles on the skin of an old secret. And then, without further ado, she inserted the tip of an old key she always carried on her keychain, one she had once used for an old trunk, trying to force the padlock. The metal gave after a couple of tries, and the padlock opened with a slight sound, almost symbolic, as if something in the air had finally said, "At last," and she lifted the lid slowly, feeling her heart pound in her chest as if it wanted to burst out. Inside, she found a packet of yellowed letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and underneath, carefully placed, a black and white photograph in which she recognized herself, many years younger, with her hair down and a different smile, the kind of smile one only has when life is just beginning. Beside her in the photo was a man she knew very well, though she hadn't seen him in decades. A man named Jack Bennett, her great love of youth, that name she had buried in her memory like a seed is buried without hope of sprouting, convinced he had abandoned her without explanation. The world, already turned upside down by the demolition, seemed to become even stranger as she held the photograph and saw in it that couple they had been and no longer were, and her mind began filling with questions she thought she had resolved long ago. Her fingers slid toward the letters and untied the ribbon with care, as if opening an old wound that never finished healing. And she began to read the first one, written in a firm but affectionate handwriting, in which Jack told her he loved her, that he wanted to marry her, that he was willing to speak to her father to officially ask for her hand, that he had found a stable job, and that finally he believed they had a real chance to build a future together. The paper, though yellowed, still retained the trace of that genuine emotion. And as she read, the years mixed in her mind, remembering the time when she received some letters from him, and then they stopped arriving, remembering how her father had put on a serious face and told her that that boy wasn't reliable, that it was better to forget about him because he had left without a trace, because surely he had found something better. And how she, devastated, had accepted with resignation that maybe it was true, that maybe she had idealized a man who didn't have the courage to stay. But now, letter after letter, she discovered another version of the story, because in the second, in the third, in the fourth, Jack insisted he didn't understand why she wasn't answering him. He said he hadn't heard from her in months, that he had gone to her house and her father had told him Dorothy didn't want to see him, that she had forgotten him, and that even so, he kept saving a place for her in his heart, hoping that someday things would clear up. And in another letter, he even mentioned he had left an engagement ring hidden in a safe place, waiting for the moment to give it to her. Every phrase was like a blow adding to the previous ones, as if someone were bringing to light not only the secret of the recent demolition, but also that of an emotional demolition that occurred years ago when she believed her great love had abandoned her without reason. Her hands began to shake harder, and the neighbors, seeing her so affected, took a step back to give her privacy, as if suddenly realizing they were witnessing something too intimate, and one of them suggested maybe it was better to leave her alone a moment. Dorothy, without looking up from the letters, murmured that she understood, that she thanked them for the help, and some withdrew. Others stayed at a certain distance, watching in case she thought of doing something reckless, but she sank a little more onto the stone where she sat, holding the letters against her chest for a few seconds before reading again, as if she needed to confirm again and again that she wasn't confused, that it wasn't a strange dream provoked by the shock of seeing her house turned into ruins. In the middle of that whirlwind of emotions, she realized something that left her cold. Those letters had dates coinciding with the months she had waited for news from Jack and hadn't received any, and some were addressed to her with her full name and her father's home address from that time, which meant they had arrived there, but never to her hands. She remembered then, like a memory illuminating suddenly in a dark corner of the mind, the times she saw her father collect the mail without giving it importance, the occasions when he seemed more serious than usual when Jack's name was mentioned, and one night when, half asleep, she thought she heard a muffled argument between her father and his mother, in which words like future convenience and stability were said. All that she didn't understand at the time now made painfully clear sense, and she understood that her father, for reasons she might never know exactly, but undoubtedly having to do with controlling her destiny and preventing her from going with someone he considered inadequate, had taken it upon himself to intercept those letters, to hide them, to decide for her that this love wasn't suitable, that she should forget it, and that the best way to achieve it was by cutting off communication without giving her explanations while making her believe it had been Jack who left her. She felt then a mixture of rage, sadness, and betrayal superimposed on the recent pain of the demolition, as if two deep wounds had opened at the same time, one in her present, another in her past, and for a moment she thought she didn't have the strength to sustain so much at once. However, something inside her, that same strength that had made her carry bricks when she was young, ignited with a new fire. And while she squeezed the letters with one hand and held the photograph with the other, she said in a low voice, but with a firmness that surprised even those who heard her, that not only had they stolen a love from her, but they had stolen a whole life, but they would not steal her soul. Those words, coming from her depths, were a declaration of war against the destiny others had decided for her, and also a pact with herself, because upon pronouncing them she understood that although she could no longer change what had happened, she still had the possibility to decide what she would do with what remained of her life, and that possibility was hers and no one else's. She looked up from the letters, looked around at the panorama of ruins, feeling that paradoxically, beneath all that dust, she had just found a treasure more valuable than any gold. The truth. She stayed sitting there for a time she couldn't measure, watching how the afternoon light turned more golden, how the dust in the air seemed to shine when pierced by the last rays of the sun. And she thought of Jack, where he might be, if he was still alive, if he had started a family, if he had managed to forget her, or if, as he himself said in one of the letters, he had kept in some corner of his soul the memory of that young woman with whom he once dreamed a future. The idea that he could still be somewhere, still breathing, still waiting perhaps for some closure, stuck in her chest like a thorn, sweet and painful at the same time. And despite having just lost her house, despite not being clear where she would sleep that night, a thought began to take shape in her mind, timid at first, then with more strength. She could look for him. She could, for the first time in decades, make a decision not based on fear or what others wanted for her, but on what her heart, despite the years, was still capable of desiring. She didn't know what she would find if she did. She didn't know if she would run into a tombstone with a man who no longer remembered her name, or with someone as wounded as she was by the deception of yesteryear, but the simple possibility of doing it filled her with an energy she hadn't felt in a long time. So it was that when night fell and a neighbor approached to offer her a place to stay in his house while she found somewhere to go, she accepted with gratitude, but made it clear her stay would be temporary because she had plans. During the simple dinner she shared with that supportive family, she explained, with a voice still broken but determined, what she had found in the box, who Jack was, what she had discovered about the letters and her father's lie. And she said she didn't plan to sit with her arms crossed, lamenting what she had lost. That yes, she was devastated by the demolished house, by her son's betrayal. But she also felt that life, amidst so much ruin, was extending a delayed hand to her, giving her a late opportunity to close a story that never had an ending. One of the neighbors, moved by her story, mentioned he had heard of a town not too far away where someone once mentioned a certain Jack Bennett, that it could be the same man, and offered to investigate a little more, to ask around, and if necessary, accompany her on a trip to look for him, because a woman of her age shouldn't be wandering around alone out there. Dorothy, looking him in the eyes, told him she accepted the help, but that she didn't do it from the place of a helpless victim, but from the conscious decision that if she was going to walk down unknown roads and streets, she would do it not to escape her current pain, but to go meet a truth that had been denied to her for too long. That night, lying in a borrowed bed, looking at a ceiling that wasn't hers, feeling the almost physical absence of her things, of her altar, of her plants, Dorothy didn't sleep much, but instead of dwelling on the fact that her son had ordered her house demolished, her mind filled with images of another time, of walks with Jack down cobblestone streets, of promises she believed forgotten, and also of the idea of seeing him. Two elderly people already wrinkled by the years, sitting perhaps in front of a cup of coffee, speaking without reproaches, sharing the pain of what was taken from them, and perhaps, God willing, still finding a last stretch of road they could travel hand in hand. At dawn, when the first birds began to sing and the light filtered through the window, she took the letters and the photograph, put them in a tote bag she kept close to her chest, and sat up with the feeling that something inside her had realigned, as if in the middle of the disaster, she had found a new axis around which the days she had left would revolve. In the following days, with the help of the neighbor who had offered, she began to organize her trip. They went to the Greyhound station, asked about routes, researched in the phone book, and among acquaintances if anyone knew for sure where Jack lived or had lived, and little by little they pieced together a map of possibilities until arriving at a town name that was repeated in several mouths, a place where, they said, an older man named Jack Bennett had worked years ago, and where some believed he still lived in a small house near the square. Hearing that was like feeling a door open in the middle of a wall she thought impassable. And then, without hesitating anymore, she decided she would go, that she would leave behind for a time the rubble of what was her house, the city that had been witness to her sacrifices and her recent loss, and she would get on a bus with her few belongings, the letters, the photo, and the determination to look the past in the face, not to live in it, but to rescue from there what could still give her strength in the present. When the day of the trip arrived, she said goodbye to the neighbor who had taken her in with a grateful hug, telling him she didn't know what she would find, but whatever it was, it gave her peace to have made that decision. Passing in front of the lot where her house used to be, she stopped for a second. She looked at the ruins, the stones, the dust, and instead of saying goodbye with tears, she whispered that she would return, that those foundations wouldn't be the end of her story, but the point where her past and her future crossed, and that although she was leaving now without a roof of her own, she carried with her something stronger than any wall, the certainty that her soul, after everything she had discovered, was indestructible. Then, with a firm step, she walked away, boarded the bus that would take her toward Jackstown, and while the vehicle started up and the city remained behind, a new stage of her life began, not despite the rubble, but precisely because of what she had found beneath it. When the bus Dorothy was traveling in finally stopped at the small, dusty terminal of that town, after hours of curves between hills and dry fields, she felt her heart beating differently, not just from the fatigue of the trip, but from the mixture of fear and hope she carried tight in her chest next to the bag where she kept the yellowed letters and the photograph in which she still recognized herself as young, taken arm in arm with that man she hadn't seen in more than 50 years. And while she slowly got up from the seat, supporting a hand on the backrest in front so as not to lose balance, she thought that maybe she was crazy for having undertaken this search at her age, without a home, with her body marked by time. But she also felt that if she backed out at that moment, she would betray herself a second time, because they had already stolen a whole life from her by hiding those letters, and she wasn't willing to let cowardice steal the little that remained of the road. Upon getting off the bus, the town's air enveloped her with that unmistakable smell of hot earth, dry leaves, and old firewood, and she saw in front of her a short main street flanked by one-story houses with peeling facades, a couple of small shops, a hot dog stand that seemed to have been there forever, and in the background the silhouette of a small church with a low steeple, all wrapped in a calm that contrasted with the whirlwind she carried inside. So she stopped for a moment, breathed deep, and told herself she was there to find answers, not to lament. The neighbor who had accompanied her to this point, a good-hearted man who didn't want to let her make the trip completely alone, looked at her with respect and asked in a low voice if she felt ready. And she responded saying that one is never ready to face the past, but it was now or never, and that she preferred to tremble standing up than to stay sitting down, yearning for what could have been. So together, they approached the first open shop, a grocery store where a man with thinning hair and a plaid shirt counted coins behind the counter. And Dorothy approached with that mixture of shyness and determination older people have when they know they are going to ask an important question. And she said, "Excuse the bother," that she was looking for a man named Jack Bennett, who had worked in that town many years ago and wanted to know if anyone knew if he was still alive, if he was still there. The shopkeeper looked up, frowned, trying to remember, and after a few seconds said yes, that of course he knew Mr. Jack, that he was very old now, that he lived a few streets up, near the little plaza, in a small house with a green fence, and added that he was a very serious man, but a very good person, a widower for some years now, who sometimes went to church with a slow step leaning on a cane. And while he spoke, Dorothy felt her hands starting to sweat, that her knees weakened a little, because hearing he was still alive was like an electric shock running through all the years of absence, and she thanked him, saying, "God bless him for the information." That split second where hope turns into reality is absolutely electrifying. She's not just chasing a memory anymore. He's real, and he's right around the corner. But after 50 years of silence, that first knock on his door is going to be the hardest thing she's ever done. Stick around, because the look on his face when he sees her is a moment you will not want to miss. She left the little store with her heart in a fist and walked accompanied by the neighbor down the narrow street where dogs slept in the shade and some women swept the sidewalk until arriving in front of a house with whitewashed walls, a wooden door, and a fence painted green that, although peeling in some parts, still preserved an air of modest dignity. And in the small front yard, a few pots were visible with hardy plants, the kind that survive neglect and the hardest suns. And she thought there was something familiar in that way of caring for the little one has, and a pang of tenderness crossed her chest, imagining an older Jack, watering those plants with the same delicacy with which he once took her hand as a young man. She stood in front of the fence, not daring to touch it for a few eternal seconds, feeling all the words she had rehearsed on the bus become disordered in her head, that she didn't know whether to introduce herself as the woman he once loved, as an old friend, as a stranger arriving with a bundle of time-worn letters. And in that hesitation, her companion told her that if she wanted he could announce her, but she responded saying no, that if she had reached there, it had to be her who faced that moment, that she didn't want intermediaries between her and the past. So she reached out, opened the gate which complained with a slight squeak, entered a few steps into the little yard, and knocked on the door with her knuckles, soft at first, then a little louder, until she heard shuffling steps on the other side, a cane tapping the floor occasionally, and an aged voice asking who it was. Dorothy swallowed hard, felt her heart rise to her throat, and responded saying she was someone from the past, someone coming from Missouri, someone who had been looking for him for many years without knowing it. And saying that, she felt her voice crack a little, but she held on, and then the door opened slowly, revealing the figure of a man with somewhat hunched shoulders, completely white hair, dark skin speckled with age spots, deep eyes framed by wrinkles that seemed to have been carved by many sorrows and a few joys. And in that look, despite the years, she could recognize a glint of the boy who once promised her the world. Jack looked at her first with suspicious curiosity, then with growing surprise, and brought a trembling hand to his chest while saying it couldn't be, that he knew those eyes from somewhere, that mouth reminded him of something. And when memory finally finished making its connections, he murmured almost without air if it was possible that it was her, Dorothy herself. Dorothy, whom he once waited to see at her door and never appeared. And when he pronounced her name, it was as if the decades melted for a moment, leaving exposed the two young people they were. She took another step toward him and said yes, that it was Dorothy, that she took too long to arrive, but that she was finally there. And then she saw how Jack's eyes filled with tears, not those scandalous tears that overflow at once, but that contained weeping that accumulates slowly on the edge of the eyelids like water in a glass about to spill, and she noticed how his aged and thin hands trembled on the handle of the cane, as if the body didn't know how to hold so many emotions together. And he, with a voice broken by emotion, said he had waited for her half a life, that there were days he thought destiny had forgotten them, that he had asked himself thousands of times what he had done wrong, why she didn't answer his letters, why her father closed the door in his face, telling him she no longer wanted to know anything about him. That at first he believed perhaps she had changed her mind, that maybe she had fallen in love with another, and that he resigned himself with pain to that idea, but that he never stopped saving a place for her in his heart, even if only as a painful memory. Upon hearing those words, Dorothy felt her own struggling to come out and lifted the tote bag hanging from her shoulder. She opened it carefully and took out the photograph and the letters, holding them in front of him like someone showing evidence of an old crime. And she said it wasn't she who stopped answering, that she never received those letters because someone took care to hide them, that she found them just a few days ago under the rubble of the house she built with her own hands, that her father buried them under the floor, just as an uncomfortable truth is buried. Jack, seeing the photograph in which they appeared young, smiling timidly, leaning on each other, and recognizing his own handwriting on the yellow letters, let out a sigh so deep it seemed to empty his chest, and extended a trembling hand to touch the paper, as if he needed to check it wasn't an illusion, that they were really there, that the story he always suspected someone had snatched from them was materialized in those sheets of paper stained by time. He invited her in, saying a conversation like that couldn't be held in the doorway, that they needed to sit down, look each other in the eyes without the weight of the sun on their necks, and led her inside the house. A small but tidy space, with old but well-kept furniture, a hand-knitted tablecloth on the dining table, a crucifix on the wall, and a shelf with few framed photographs where she managed to distinguish the face of a woman who must have been his wife, and of other adults who were perhaps relatives, and she was internally glad not to see children or faces claiming a story she had no right to touch. When they sat face to face with the table as the only limit, Jack rested the cane to one side, discreetly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and said he needed her to tell him everything, that he wanted to know why those letters had slept underground and why they had taken so long to find each other again. And Dorothy, who had been mentally rehearsing that story for days, breathed deep and began to speak not only for him but also for herself. Because saying it aloud was a way of ordering the chaos, she told him that in those years her father had a hard character, that he always saw her as the depository of his own frustrations, that when he learned Jack wanted to marry her, he made 1,000 excuses, saying he had nothing to offer her, that dreams didn't fill the belly nor pay bills, that he wouldn't allow his daughter to go with a man he didn't consider good enough, and how from one day to the next the letters stopped arriving and her father began telling her Jack hadn't shown up again, that surely he had forgotten her, that that's how life was, that one had to move on. She described the nights she cried in silence in her bed, squeezing between her hands the last letter she received, wondering what had happened, what she did wrong, why no one gave her an explanation, and how little by little she resigned herself, convincing herself that perhaps he had decided to take another path that left her behind without saying goodbye, and accepted the idea that that part of her life was closed, burying it under the routine of her work at school, the responsibility of caring for her parents when they began to age, and later, raising a son whom her father never finished accepting as worthy. Then she spoke to him of the present, of how after so many decades, the house she built with her own hands was demolished by her own son, blinded by ambition and pushed by a wife who despised her simplicity. She described the feeling of arriving at the street and finding only a pile of rubble where a home full of memories used to be, and how, while searching among the remains, she found the metal box with the letters and the photograph he saw now, and the mixture of rage and relief that invaded her upon discovering that what she believed all her life hadn't been true, that she wasn't abandoned, but separated by the decision of a father who thought he knew what was best for her. Jack listened in silence, with his eyes locked on her, pressing his lips occasionally to contain the emotion. And when she finished, there was a moment of heavy silence in which only the tick-tock of a wall clock and the slight creak of a wooden chair shifting legs were heard. And then he said he always suspected something like that had happened, that her father's words never squared when he said Dorothy no longer wanted to see him because he knew her heart. He knew she wasn't a woman to erase him from one day to the next without explanation, but that over time he stopped asking questions because he had no proof, only intuitions, and resigned himself to living with that hole, building another life as best he could, marrying a good woman with whom he shared years of respect, but never the same type of love he felt for her, and that, even so, he never threw away the engagement ring he had made for Dorothy, nor the copies of the letters he wrote her, because it seemed to him that doing so would be like betraying something sacred. He got up with difficulty, walked to a small dresser, and opened a drawer where he rummaged for a few seconds until taking out a small velvet box already faded by the years. To keep a ring for half a century requires a kind of devotion that is rare in today's world. It makes you wonder if it's ever truly too late to reclaim a stolen past. But Dorothy isn't looking for a fairy tale ending just yet. She has a plan that will surprise you. He returned to the table, sat down, and put it in front of her. Then he opened it with a trembling hand and revealed a simple but beautiful ring of thin gold with a small, clear stone in the center, and said that for decades he had kept it with the absurd hope of someday being able to give it to her, even if only to close a cycle, and that although life had run its course, his wife's death, the illness he now felt in his chest every time he climbed a slope, the loneliness of old age, he never saw the right moment to get rid of it, as if some part of his heart knew something was still left to say. Dorothy looked at the ring, not like a woman expecting a proposal, because the time for youth's promises had passed long ago, but like someone contemplating a symbol of what could have been and wasn't, a material proof that she wasn't crazy, thinking someone once loved her with the same intensity she loved, and she felt a mixture of gratitude and sadness, so deep her eyes filled with silent tears. Then, with a low but firm voice, she told him she couldn't give him back the years stolen from them, that she couldn't undo decisions taken nor resurrect the woman with whom he had shared half his life, but that she was there now with his letters in her lap, with the truth unearthed, and she wanted to know if even at this point in the road there was room to share something, even if it was little, even if it was only late conversations and shared silences on a bench at sunset. Jack, moved, responded, saying that for him it was enough to be able to see her, to know she hadn't abandoned him out of whim or lack of love, and that if she allowed him, he wanted to offer her something more than memories. He wanted to offer her a roof, a house, a bed to sleep in, company in the mornings and afternoons, someone to heat soup when the cold got into the bones, because he couldn't stand the idea that she had lost her house and was tumbling around without having anywhere to lay her head. He added that if she stayed with him, he would take charge of caring for her in that final stage of life, that they could live together as companions, as two old folks who found each other again and decided never to separate again. She listened to that offer with a tender heart, because in those words there was no pity, but deep affection and a genuine desire to repair as much as possible the injustices of the past. But she also felt that accepting to stay there, sheltered under another's roof, even that of a man she loved, would mean giving up something her soul demanded with force since the day of the demolition, the need to rebuild herself, to raise again herself with her own hands the dignity that had been ripped away along with the walls of her house. So she breathed deep and responded, saying she appreciated more than she could explain that offer, that knowing he was willing to open his home and life to her at that moment was a gift she didn't expect to receive. But she wasn't looking for refuge. She didn't want to hide from the pain under a new roof, but to face it by returning to Missouri and rebuilding the house her son tore down. Not out of stone obstinacy, but because in those foundations were buried not only her memories, but now also the truth of her history with him, and she felt that if she didn't return to raise that place, she would continue being a prisoner of others' decisions. She said she wished with all her strength that he would be with her in that process, that she imagined nothing more beautiful at this stage of life than seeing the two of them, already old, raising wall by wall, the house destiny denied them inhabiting together as youths, and that if he accepted that challenge, she could consider part of the debt they felt time owed them as paid. Jack looked at her with a mixture of admiration and surprise, because he was used to seeing people his age resign themselves, sit in a chair waiting for death, talking only of illnesses and what could no longer be done. And yet, there was Dorothy at her 70-something years talking about reconstruction, about travel, about hands in the dough, and that determination reminded him why he had fallen in love with her half a century ago. He smiled with a tired but sincere smile, and said that if he had any health, strength, and time left, he was willing to spend it on that enterprise. That the idea of going to Missouri, of facing the rubble together and turning it into new walls, seemed to him not only a way to help her, but also a way to give meaning to his own last years, because he was already tired of sitting watching time pass him by, and that he preferred to die with his boots on, as they say, with hands full of brick dust instead of breadcrumbs. He added that they needed to organize, see what to do with his house in town, speak with some acquaintance who could keep an eye on it while he was away, gather some important things, and above all, ask God to give them the necessary strength to undertake that journey back to the origin. In the following days, Jack's small house filled with an activity it hadn't seen in a long time. Dorothy stayed there while they arranged details, helping where she could, organizing papers, sweeping the patio, cleaning the table where so many times he had sat alone to eat, and every gesture of hers filled the space with life, as if the house itself realized it was witnessing a late miracle. Jack, although he tired easily, insisted on doing things himself. He introduced himself to some neighbors to tell them he would be away for a while, that he was going to Missouri to accompany a friend from youth who had gone through a misfortune, and they looked at him with surprise and curiosity, noticing the new light in his eyes when he spoke of that trip. One afternoon, while reviewing a small box with documents and memories, he took out the ring again and held it between his fingers with delicacy, and said he didn't intend to make a formal proposal like in those years, because at this point, more than promises, what they could offer each other was company and honesty. But he would like her to accept the ring not as a symbol of a marriage that no longer made sense to consummate, but as a seal of that alliance they were about to undertake. The alliance to face together the reconstruction of her house and their own souls. And she, moved, responded saying she accepted it with pleasure, that she would wear it as a reminder that the love once snatched from them hadn't disappeared entirely, but had transformed into that force now pushing them to rise once more. While that happened in the small town, back in the city, Travis's life crumbled with the same speed with which he believed someday he would rise. The municipal authorities, alerted by indignant neighbors who didn't understand how the demolition of a respected elder's house had been authorized, reviewed the permits and detected irregularity signatures that didn't match, false stamps which triggered an investigation that fell upon him like a rain of stones. And the banks, upon learning he had committed an illegal act to try to save an already unsustainable economic situation, hardened their stance, demanding pending payments immediately, initiating foreclosure proceedings on his assets, on the apartment where he lived with Jessica, on the car he liked to show off so much. The calls from creditors became constant. His phone rang at all hours, and every time he saw an unknown number on the screen, his heart accelerated in a way that had nothing to do with the thrill of triumph, but with the panic of knowing himself cornered. Jessica, who was used to the life of appearances, to dining out, to buying new clothes every season, to bragging about her husband's contacts, began to get impatient, to look at him no longer with that feigned admiration with which she pushed him to take risky decisions, but with growing contempt, blaming him for everything, telling him how he could be so stupid to falsify papers, that was something for people without resources, not for someone aspiring to move in high circles. And he, who once listened to her as if she were an oracle of modernity, began to feel that that woman he wanted to please so much had no intention of accompanying him in the fall. The arguments in his house became more and more frequent, sourer, full of reproaches. And one day, when he received the official notification that his apartment would be seized, and he stood staring at the paper with a blank mind, Jessica packed what she considered essential in a suitcase, some jewelry, clothes, documents, and planted herself in front of him, saying she hadn't been born to be poor, that she didn't plan to stay there waiting to be thrown out on the street, that he should figure it out however he could, that there was already a man willing to offer her what he promised and never could fulfill. And without further ado, she left, leaving a scent of expensive perfume floating in the air, like a cruel reminder of the superficiality upon which they had built their relationship. Travis stayed alone, sitting on the sofa, with the seizure document in one hand and the suitcase that didn't leave in the other. And for the first time in a long time, the silence of his house seemed heavier than any complaint, because in that silence also resonated his mother's words, those he despised when she told him the house was worth everything because it was made with love, not pride. Shortly after, when the seizure became effective, when he had to hand over the keys to the apartment and the car, when he found himself literally on the street with a few bags of clothes and papers under his arm, he thought at least he had his mother's land left, that he could sell it even if it was full of rubble. But a new bitter surprise awaited him. The same false documents he had used to get the demolition turned against him, and the authorities resolved that any operation on that land remained suspended until further notice, that he had to answer legally for the damages caused to his mother's property, which meant that for the moment, not only could he not profit from that place, but he couldn't even approach it without the neighbors looking at him like the traitor he was. Without options, he began sleeping some nights in the old car he managed to keep, parking it almost by inertia near the lot where Dorothy's house once stood, contemplating from the window the mound of ruins, which were now also a symbol of his own life. And in that reduced space, wrapped in a mixture of old upholstery smell and sweat, he began to face for the first time what he had done, not as a failed calculation, but as an act of cruelty against the woman who had raised him. It was in that context of ruin and loneliness that weeks later, the figure of a bus coming from the town where Jack lived appeared again in the Missouri terminal, and from it, two elderly people who, despite evident tiredness, walked with a determination that attracted attention. The lowest point came on a rainy Tuesday. Travis had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. He sat in his car, the engine off to save gas, watching a family leave a diner across the street. He saw a young man holding an umbrella for his elderly mother, guiding her gently to the passenger seat, laughing at something she said. The image hit Travis with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the times Dorothy would wait up for him with a plate of hot food, no matter how late he came home. He remembered how her hands, rough from laying bricks, felt soft when she checked his fever as a child. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but the hunger in his soul was worse. He looked at his own hands, clean, manicured, but empty. He had traded a mother's unconditional love for a wife who loved only his credit limit, and a home for a concrete fantasy that never existed. Tears, hot and bitter, finally spilled over. For the first time, he wasn't crying for his lost money. He was crying for the son he used to be, the son who had died long before the house did. It's often said that we don't appreciate what we have until it's gone, and for Travis, that lesson came at the highest possible price. Now that he's hit rock bottom, the big question remains: is redemption even possible after such a betrayal? The answer might not be what you expect. Miss Dorothy, with her tote bag pressed against her chest, and Mr. Jack leaning on his cane, with the ring she had accepted gleaming discreetly on one of her fingers like a small personal sun. Upon returning to her city, she didn't go directly to the land, because she knew she needed a place to leave her few things and organize her mind before facing that void again. So they went first to the neighbor's house, who had taken her in the previous time, who received them with open arms, marveling to see she didn't return alone, but accompanied by that kind-eyed man whom she introduced, saying he was an old love destiny, had returned to her when she had lost almost everything. And the man, who wasn't used to romance novel stories in his neighborhood, got emotional, thinking perhaps God had strange but beautiful ways of balancing the scales. After sharing a simple coffee and thanking the hospitality, Dorothy said she didn't want to delay any longer, that she needed to go see the land, that although she had already seen it at its worst moment, now she wanted to see it with other eyes, with Jack by her side, like someone facing a wound accompanied by the surgeon who will help close it. And they walked together through the known streets until arriving at the corner where time ago she collapsed upon seeing the demolition. The mound of rubble was still there, although a little lower, because the rains and the passage of time had been washing away the edges, and because some usable materials were removed by anonymous hands that always prowl places where something collapses. But the image remained that of an open wound in the middle of the neighborhood, a sort of earthen mouth that seemed to have devoured a whole house. Jack stopped dead upon seeing that, feeling his breath cut short, because although he already knew the story, it was another thing to see with his own eyes the place where the woman he loved had lived, and which was now a pile of stones, and said that that was a barbarity, that he didn't understand how someone could order something like that destroyed, knowing how much it had cost to raise it, and his hands tightened around the cane handle with a strength he didn't know he still had. Dorothy, instead of crying like the previous time, approached the edge of the rubble and crouched a little, picking up a small broken brick that had slid to the sidewalk, held it at eye level, and said that was what the world saw, a piece of broken material, but that for her every brick had a name, a date, a night of sleeplessness, and she didn't plan to let her story end like this. She turned toward Jack and told him that was the reason she had brought him, that she wanted him to see what they were going to work with, that it wouldn't be easy, that there would be days the body wouldn't respond as before, but that if he remained willing, together they could transform that mountain of ruins into something new, stronger, more beautiful. And he responded saying he was there precisely for that he hadn't come to the city to sightsee or remember pretty places, but to roll up his sleeves and put his grain of sand in the reconstruction of that house, which in some way he also felt was his, even if he had never lived in it. He added that besides, they wouldn't be alone, that knowing the story and the people, he was sure many would join to help them, because no one is indifferent to a woman who, after losing everything, is willing to get up again. And so it was. The news that Miss Dorothy had returned, accompanied by an older man who turned out to be her love of youth, reunited after half a century, ran through the neighborhood like a rumor charged with emotion, and soon neighbors, acquaintances, former students who were now adults, with modest jobs but grateful memories of the teacher who taught them to read and add, began to appear. All of them arriving at the lot with faces mixing shame for not having been able to prevent the demolition and desire to do something now, even if it was late. One of them, who had experience as a contractor, offered to direct the basic jobs of clearing the land and laying new foundations. He said they couldn't build on unstable ruins, that they had to remove what didn't serve, check the foundations, and that he would gladly donate his knowledge and part of his time. Another neighbor who worked at a hardware store promised to get materials at a better price, maybe even donate some. Former students who were now teachers, drivers, clerks, offered workdays on weekends, and so little by little the land, which had been a symbol of destruction, began to fill with people moving stones, carrying buckets, placing boards, and in the middle of everyone, under the sun and with an old cap for protection, the small but firm figure of Dorothy was seen, not limiting herself to giving orders, but taking the shovel, lifting rubble, cleaning with her own hands the remains of her old house, while Jack, although unable to make very big efforts due to his heart problem, took charge of tasks requiring more precision than strength, like checking levels, passing tools, coordinating small details, sitting at times in a chair they had put under the shade of a tree, but never disconnected from the process, while life was reborn on that land by dint of solidarity. In a not-too-distant corner of the same city, Travis watched that same place from a distance, sitting inside his car, with a grown beard, wrinkled clothes, and sunken eyes from nights of insomnia, and felt that every shovel blow was also a blow to his pride, proof that his grandiose plan to throw away the old, to raise something modern and profitable, had not only failed, but had given way to something much bigger than him, something he didn't control. And now his mother's story was rewriting itself without need of his participation. At first, he avoided getting too close because he knew the neighbor's rage against him was legitimate, and because he couldn't stand the idea of facing Dorothy's gaze. But every day, as if pushed by an invisible force, he drove there, parked a block away, and observed from the protection of his cabin the silhouettes moving. Until one day, he clearly saw his mother with a handkerchief on her head, crouching to lift a bucket, and an older man taking her by the elbow to help her up a small step. And a pang of jealousy and shame pierced him when he knew, through comments picked up on the street, that that man was Jack, the love of youth his grandfather had rejected, the same one he didn't even know, but who was now there doing for her what he as a son didn't have the decency to do, accompany her in the reconstruction. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and little by little, where before there was only rubble, the shape of a new house began to define itself. First were the clean bases, then the first rows of bricks carefully placed. The smell of fresh mixture mixed with the dust still present, and the sound of shovels and picks was now a rhythm that didn't destroy, but created. Dorothy, although her body asked for rest, felt rejuvenated by the sensation of seeing a house born of her effort rise once more. But this time she wasn't alone, and every brick placed carried also Jack's love and the generosity of the neighbors. The design of the new house respected the essence of the previous one. The central patio, the wash basin at the back, a simple living room, but also incorporated some improvements they could never afford in the past, like slightly larger windows, better ventilation, a small extra room where they planned to store the memories they were rescuing from among the remains. It was during one of those workdays when they were digging a little deeper to reinforce certain foundation points when one of the masons, a man weathered by years of construction, drove his pick into the ground and noticed the earth responded differently, with a metallic sound and a color that wasn't usual. He crouched, investigating a metallic thud his pick had made. Clearing away the dirt, he didn't find a pipe, but the rotted remains of a heavy wooden chest, split open to reveal the glint of gold coins spilling into the soil, and told him to look at that which seemed strange to him. And the other, with a basic knowledge of materials, said he couldn't assure it, but maybe they were seeing a vein of some metal, maybe copper, maybe gold, and that the best thing would be to notify someone who knew. The news ran fast through the site, and soon Dorothy and Jack were standing next to the small hole, looking at that earth mixed with yellow sparkles. And although neither was an expert in geology, they felt there was something more there than simply stones. A neighbor engineer, a former student of Dorothy's, upon finding out, offered to bring a colleague who understood the subject. And a few days later, a man with a white helmet, boots, and a sample briefcase introduced himself, collected some pieces of material, took notes, asked questions about depth and extension, and promised to send results after analyzing them. When he returned with the report in hand, he met with them at the site and told them that what they had found was a buried cache of gold coins, likely from the mid-19th century, hidden there by a previous landowner long before the town was even built, under the house without anyone knowing. And that, while it wasn't a gigantic deposit justifying excessive industrial exploitation, it did have considerable value, enough to, with the proper concessions and permits, generate resources that could significantly improve Dorothy's situation. Upon hearing that, Jack looked at Dorothy, expecting some reaction of euphoria, but instead of seeing greed in her eyes, he saw something softer, a mixture of awe and gratitude. And she, after a few seconds of silence, smiled and said all her life she had been standing on gold without knowing it. But now she understood the real gold wasn't in the dirt, but in not giving up, in keeping digging even when one believes they've lost everything, because only then do you reach what truly matters. Most people would keep that treasure for themselves, especially after losing everything. But Dorothy's reaction shows her true character. This decision is going to ripple through the community in a way no one saw coming. Stay with us to see how this final twist reshapes everyone's future. And her words expanded through the group of people surrounding them, like a simple but deep teaching, a sort of life moral many kept in their hearts. With the engineer's advice and some people with legal knowledge, Dorothy managed to process the necessary permits, so a part of the wealth of that find became money, not through devastating exploitation of the land, but through a careful agreement respecting the place's integrity and municipal rules. And when she had the first figures in front of her, when she saw what that gold vein could represent in economic terms, far from thinking of late luxuries for herself, she made a decision that surprised many, but deep down was coherent with her whole life. She said a part would be used to finish building the house to ensure neither she nor Jack suffered need in whatever time they had left. But the rest she wanted to destine to something transcending her own story, something benefiting the neighborhood that had seen her struggle, the town that had poured out to help her. And the idea sprouted almost alone. Build a school, or rather a learning center in her old neighborhood, a place where adult men and women could learn trades, finish their studies, find opportunities she herself always valued as a teacher. When she announced it in an informal meeting with neighbors, some were left open-mouthed, wondering how it was possible that a woman who had just recovered a little stability after losing everything was thinking of giving the greater part of her newly acquired wealth. But those who knew her well weren't so surprised, because they knew that in Dorothy's heart, that vocation to teach and share had always existed. She explained she had believed in the power of education all her life, that she knew many of her former students couldn't continue studying because they had to start working young, that others never learned a trade well because no one gave them the opportunity to train, and it seemed fair to her that if the earth had kept that gold under her feet for so long, now that gold should serve to open doors for others, to build not only walls but also futures. Jack listened with shining eyes, proud to be beside a woman who, instead of becoming harder after so much pain, seemed to soften in the noblest sense, becoming even more generous. That was how. While the house finished rising with firm bricks and freshly painted walls smelling of lime and hope, planning also began for that learning center, to be built a few streets from there, on a lot the municipality agreed to destine for it upon seeing the positive impact it could have. The blueprints were drawn on the same table where Dorothy had reviewed student notebooks with the help of the engineer, former student, and other volunteers. And in every stroke, the desire to create a worthy but simple place was noticeable, with wide classrooms, good lighting, a patio where people could gather to talk, to share experiences. When the moment arrived to start the work, the community was summoned, and many of those who had helped rebuild the house raised their hands again, willing to work for something that would benefit not just one person, but many. It was at that point in the road, when rumors of that center's construction were already running, and Dorothy's house, now almost finished, looked beautiful from the street, with its light walls, new windows, and small reborn garden, with plants starting to sprout new leaves, that karma, unlike a mother, does not forgive. Travis's fall was swift and brutal. The demolition had been illegal, a fraud committed in haste. The police arrived at his luxury office, not with questions, but with handcuffs. He was dragged out in front of his peers, the humiliation burning his skin. Jessica didn't just leave. She testified against him to save herself, listing every crooked deal he had made. He lost the apartment, he lost the car, he lost his reputation. But the cruelest blow came when he found himself sleeping under a bridge, shivering in the cold, realizing that the pile of junk he had demolished was the only warm place that had ever truly welcomed him. He was now the homeless one, a beggar in a city he thought he owned. It took months of hunger and absolute solitude for the arrogance to break, leaving only a frightened child inside. He had spent too many nights in the car parked in front of different places, feeling he didn't belong anywhere. And in all those nights, the memory of his mother, kneeling among rubble, pursued him like a shadow that wouldn't leave. So one day, overcoming the shame gripping him, he approached the neighborhood where he grew up, walking slowly through the same streets he ran as a child, but now, without the arrogance of before, with slumped shoulders, empty hands, almost like a stranger. Upon arriving in front of the new house, he stopped, impressed by the change, because although he recognized the location, everything else was different, brighter, firmer, and it hurt him to think it had been another man, and not him, who had been there by his mother's side, helping her build that. He touched the fence with a timid gesture, almost asking permission from the air before doing so, and waited with his heart pounding against his ribs until he heard steps and saw Dorothy appear in the doorframe with her hair pulled back, a clean apron, and an expression in which upon seeing him mixed surprise, pain, and something he didn't know how to identify at first, because it wasn't hate nor an overflowing joy, but a kind of sad calm. He lowered his gaze, incapable of sustaining hers, and said he knew he had no right to show up there after what he did, that he didn't expect her to receive him with open arms, that he came because he could no longer stand the weight of his own guilt, that he needed to ask for forgiveness, even if it was late, and even if she didn't accept it. And while he spoke, words got stuck in his throat because he wasn't used to showing himself vulnerable, least of all in front of her. He told her he was left with nothing, that Jessica abandoned him, that justice was pursuing him for the false papers, that he slept in the car, that he had lost everything he believed gave him value, and that in that fall he had understood that the only true wealth he ever had was the house she built and the love she gave him, and that he himself had demolished it with his decisions. Dorothy listened to that unburdening in silence, without interrupting him, with eyes locked on her son, seeing not only the man she had had before her in recent years, haughty and contemptuous, but also the boy who once ran through the yard of her old house, laughing without malice. And when he finished, when he lowered his head even more and said he understood if she never wanted to see him again, that just hearing her forgiveness from afar was enough for him to try to move on in some way. She breathed deep, leaned a hand on the doorframe to support herself, and responded saying forgiveness wasn't a coin given to whoever came with the correct face, that forgiveness was an act freeing first, the one granting it, and that although her heart had suffered like never before, seeing him destroy the roof under which she raised him, she wasn't willing to live the time she had left poisoned by resentment. She said she forgave him, but that forgiveness didn't erase consequences, that the ruins he left didn't rise alone, that there were old and strange hands doing the work corresponding to him as a son, and that's why, if he truly wanted to start repairing what he did, he shouldn't ask her for a roof, because a roof is earned, not demanded, but work. Travis looked up confused and asked her what she meant by that, and she explained with a firm voice, but without harshness, that they were about to build the learning center for the neighborhood, that hands were needed to carry, mix, lift, that there would be no titles or prestige positions there, only people willing to sweat for something benefiting others, and that if he wanted to be close to her again, if he wanted to start rebuilding the house he demolished inside himself, then accept working as a helper on that site under the foreman's orders, without privileges, without special treatment for being her son, presenting himself as one more, with a hard hat, with gloves, with the humility of someone recognizing he isn't doing a favor, but trying to balance a scale he himself unbalanced. She added she wasn't going to offer him a room in her house at that moment, because it wasn't about rescuing him like a child, but giving him the chance to walk, and that if he demonstrated with deeds, not words, that he had changed, then life would open space for him again next to her. The words fell on Travis like cold water, because deep down he expected perhaps a more emotional reaction, more motherly, opening the door and welcoming him without conditions. But he also knew, in that same instant, that what she offered him was more valuable than any impulsive gesture. She offered him the possibility of recovering his dignity, not as an heir receiving unearned goods, but as a man rolling up his sleeves and dirtying his hands, just as he always should have done. This is a powerful moment of tough love. She's offering him a path to self-respect rather than an easy way out. It's a risky move, but it might be the only way to truly save her son. Let's find out if Travis has the strength to rebuild not just the walls, but his own soul. He swallowed hard, nodded, and said he accepted, that he would present himself at the site on the indicated day, that he was willing to carry, mix, lift sacks, do whatever was necessary, and that he didn't do it only for her, but also for himself, because he was already tired of living like a ghost, fleeing the shadow of his own decisions. Dorothy, hearing that, felt a small spark of hope light up in some corner of her soul, but didn't let it grow too much immediately, because she knew promises of the mouth are easy, and she responded saying then she expected him at the site, that she would speak with the foreman to take him on as one more, without mentioning he was her son, so any treatment he received would be for his attitude and not out of pity. And so the next day, when the sun barely began to peek over the neighborhood rooftops, Travis showed up at the lot where the learning center would rise in simple clothes, old pants, a worn t-shirt, and sturdy shoes he had managed to keep. The foreman looked him up and down, without recognizing him as the haughty man who once arrived in a car to order a house demolition, and asked what he knew how to do. And he responded saying not much, that he was willing to learn, to start from basics, to carry whatever was needed. And quickly he saw himself with a bucket in his hands, mixing sand, cement, and water, following instructions, sweating under the morning sun, feeling his muscles, accustomed to office comfort and car seats, complain from the effort. During the first days, more than one neighbor recognized him and looked at him with suspicion. Some murmured what was he doing there, what nerve he had, but the foreman, who didn't know the story well, limited himself to saying he was one more worker, and as long as he complied, he saw no reason to fire him. And little by little, as days passed and people saw him arrive early, leave late, stay until the end to gather tools, clean mixture remnants, share his simple food sitting on a cement sack, the murmur of condemnation diminished, replaced by silent curiosity. From the prudent distance of someone wanting to let deeds speak, Dorothy observed her son at the site, hiding sometimes behind a corner's shadow, watching him carry sacks, stop to catch his breath, wipe sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, accept without protest the foreman's corrections. And in those scenes, she saw, perhaps for the first time, a Travis capable of putting his body at the service of something not bringing him immediate benefit. A man starting to understand by force what it means for hands to get stained with dirt and cement to build something real. Jack, accompanying her sometimes on those discreet visits, told her that work was a form of prayer, an act going beyond words, and that if the boy persevered, maybe both hearts, mother and son, would find a way to reconcile fully. The learning center took shape, first as a basic structure of columns and roofs, then as clearly delineated classrooms, with walls rising straight and firm. Light colors were chosen for the walls. Wide windows were placed, allowing generous light entry. An interior patio was designed with simple benches, where attendees, all adults of different ages, could sit to converse, review notes, rest between classes, and in every detail, Dorothy's hand was noticeable, wanting that place to be welcoming but sober, inviting concentration and respect. When finally the day arrived to place the last symbolic stone, to consider the main structure finished, all who had participated gathered to see it placed, and among them, mixed with hands still covered in dark stains, was Travis, who, looking up toward the building, felt he was seeing not only a community center, but a sort of mirror of his own transformation. The inauguration came some months later, when everything was ready, when the last details were painted, when modest desks, clean blackboards, shelves for books and materials were installed. That day, the whole neighborhood seemed to celebrate, because it wasn't common for such a work to rise in a place often seemingly forgotten by authorities. Discreetly colored flags hung at the entrance, and a small crowd of adults, Dorothy's former students, neighbors, distant relatives, gathered to witness that moment. At the door, a simple ribbon waited to be cut, and at the center of the scene were Miss Dorothy and Mr. Jack, arm in arm, dressed in their best clothes, she in a sober but elegant dress, he in a clean shirt, a jacket that perhaps fit a little big but he wore with pride, and the ring symbolizing their alliance gleaming a little more under the afternoon sun. Before cutting the ribbon, there were words. Some who spoke were former students, telling how Dorothy's teachings in the old school had opened paths for them, how learning to read and write well allowed them to get more dignified jobs, and now, seeing her use the gold found under her foundations to build a place benefiting others, they felt life was closing a circle in a beautiful way. She also took the floor with a simple microphone in hand and said she never imagined that after seeing her house in ruins, she would be standing in front of a new building, surrounded by so many loved faces, and that if she had learned anything from everything she lived, it was that when life knocks down our walls, sometimes it's not to leave us in the open, but so we find what was hidden underneath, both in the earth and in our own heart. She spoke of the gold the land held, but insisted the real gold was the generosity of hands working for free, the strength of those who didn't leave her alone, the love she had found again in Jack, and the capacity to forgive that God had granted her so as not to remain trapped in resentment. When she finished her brief speech, she asked Jack to accompany her to cut the ribbon, and together, with old but sharp scissors, they made that symbolic gesture, opening the center's doors. People applauded, some cried, and among the crowd, a little apart with shiny eyes, was Travis, watching his mother receive the applause she always deserved and never had before, and felt something tear and recompose inside him at the same time. He waited for the formal ceremony to end, for people to enter to see the classrooms, and when he saw Dorothy step aside a little toward a corner of the patio to get air, he approached, aware that this was an important moment, and told her he had been observing everything, that he had never seen her so full, so surrounded by affection, and that he wanted to tell her something he had been feeling for a time but hadn't been capable of expressing, that he demolished her house believing he was building his future, but that she, with everything she did after, had taught him to build his inside, that thanks to her example and the opportunity to work on that site, he had started to understand who he really was and what kind of man he wanted to be. She, hearing those words, looked at him with a tenderness that this time wasn't mixed with so much sadness, and responded saying, "Walls are raised with hands, but men are raised with forgiveness, that it wasn't cement keeping that house standing, nor bricks making that center strong, but the decision to let love and faith occupy the places where before there was only pride and fear." She added, he still had a road to travel. That work didn't end with that building. That internal reconstruction takes longer than any physical construction. But that she was willing to walk by his side in that task, as long as he continued demonstrating with deeds that he had left behind the man who chose ambition over family. Time, which doesn't stop even when we feel we should pause to assimilate everything, ran its course, and months after the center's inauguration, with classrooms already full of adults going at night to learn to read better, finish high school, take carpentry, sewing, electricity workshops, Dorothy's new house became the home she had dreamed, although not in the terms she once imagined. On a warm afternoon, while she sat by the window in the living room, patiently sewing the hem of a curtain she wanted to adjust, she heard Jack's breathing behind her, reclining in an armchair, become slower and deeper, as if the body were entering a different rest. And turning around, she saw the expression on his face was peaceful, that there was no longer pain or worry, that his hands, which so many times had offered her support, rested open on his lap. She got up carefully, approached, took one of those hands between hers, and felt the warmth beginning to fade, understanding with that painful lucidity those who have seen death up close sometimes have, that he was leaving. She didn't scream or crumble, because she knew for him death wasn't a punishment, but a rest, a return, and she stayed there a while, holding his hand, speaking to him in a low voice, although he could no longer hear her, telling him she thanked him for having waited so long, for having kept those letters, for having accepted accompanying her in the reconstruction, for having shown her love isn't measured in years shared, but in the depth with which one allows oneself to be seen by another, and that she hoped to meet him again when God decided. Perhaps in some place where there were neither hidden letters nor houses demolished by greed, only open fields and benches in the sun. Then she got up, opened the window to let in a little fresh air and light, watched the sunset dye the neighborhood rooftops orange, and with a voice barely audible but full of meaning, said she now understood the rubble had been her path to heaven. Not because she wished to die, but because thanks to everything that collapsed, she had been able to see clearly which things were eternal and which weren't. Years passed as they always pass, and Miss Dorothy's figure became physically more fragile, but bigger in the memory of those who knew her. When finally her time came, she went without stridency in her bed, in that house she had rebuilt with the help of many, surrounded by some people who loved her and promised to honor her legacy. After her departure, the entire neighborhood gathered to decide what to do with that house that would no longer be inhabited by her, and the idea of converting it into a community museum was almost unanimous, a place open to whoever wanted to know the story of the teacher who lost everything and still gave everything. A simple sign with firm letters was placed at the entrance saying, "The Indestructible House," in memory of the woman who demonstrated that love and faith are foundations that don't collapse. And inside, in the rooms, small corners were organized, telling different chapters of her life. A wall with photos of her at school, another with newspaper clippings speaking of the small gold vein found, a display case where the metal box found under the rubble rested, some of Jack's letters, the photograph of both youths, the ring he had given her, and which she wanted to leave there as a symbol of that love transcending time. Travis, who by then had continued working at the Learning Center, first as a construction helper, then as maintenance staff, and over time also as a volunteer in some activities, offered to be the museum caretaker, and no one objected, because by then he had already earned the silent respect of many by demonstrating day after day that his repentance wasn't a passing pose. Every morning, he arrived early, opened the door of the Indestructible House, swept the floor with methodical movements, dusted the display cases, checked that the photographs were straight, that the plants in the small garden had enough water, and when throughout the day visitors arrived, adults from different places, some from the same neighborhood, others from nearby cities, even from distant places, who had heard the story of the teacher who found gold among the rubble, he guided them with respect, telling them with careful words what the original house was like, how he demolished it, moved by ambition and blindness, how his mother found the box with the letters, how she met Jack, how they rebuilt the house with everyone's help, how they decided to invest the gold in a learning center, and how forgiveness saved him from becoming forever the villain of his own life. At the museum entrance, hung in a privileged place, was a portrait of Miss Dorothy in her last years, with completely white hair, a serene smile, and shining eyes of someone knowing she has fulfilled her mission. And every time Travis finished a guided tour and people stayed silent a few seconds in front of that portrait, he took the opportunity to share, almost like a confession, that she built a house. Yes, but in the end, what she really built was a world, one where people understood poverty isn't in materials, but in the heart refusing to love, and that to him, her son, she had given the opportunity to tear down the walls of pride he had built inside to, brick by brick, edify something better. When he closed the doors at the end of the day, with the sun setting and shadows lengthening on the patio, he stayed a few moments alone, standing in front of the portrait and whispered, almost like a daily prayer, that she had built a house and ended up building a world, as if he needed to repeat it to himself so as never to forget. And then, before turning off the lights, he also remembered the phrase that had remained engraved in the memory of all who knew the story, that one saying her son demolished her home, but among the rubble she found the gold of faith, the love of the past, and the strength to become eternal. And he understood with humble gratitude that although he could never undo what he did, he could live in a way honoring forever the indestructible woman who brought him into the world. And so ends the story of Miss Dorothy. They often say, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." Miss Dorothy proved that even when your whole world crumbles beneath your feet, as long as you hold on to faith and forgiveness, you can rebuild an empire from the ashes. Travis destroyed a house made of brick, but his mother taught him how to rebuild a house made of character. In the end, the greatest treasure wasn't the vein of gold underground, but the forgiveness that saved a lost son. How about you? If you were Dorothy, would you have the courage to give Travis a second chance after the cruelty he inflicted? Or were you more moved by the timeless, soulmate love of Mr. Jack? Please share your honest thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read them and chat with you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with your loved ones. Thank you for listening until the very end. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next moving story.